You hear it first in the corridors, those low-pitched footsteps that echo through the marble spine of Washington, D.C. The air in the federal courthouse carries its own kind of weight, the hush before the gavel drops. Somewhere beyond the metal detectors and the faint smell of old paper sits a man whose name most citizens wouldn't know. Judge Reggie Walton. He was born far from the power corridors that would one day learn his voice. Reggie Walton came into the world on February 8, 1949, in Donora, Pennsylvania, a small steel town where the Monongahela River bends like a coil of gray ribbon. Donora had once been famous for its smog, for a poisonous fog that rolled over the valley in 1948 and left 24 people dead. That was the landscape into which Walton was born. Steel, soot, and survival. In interviews decades later, Walton would remember that growing up there meant learning to hold your ground. He wasn't born into privilege. He was shaped by the friction of ordinary life, the kind that forces you to build resilience or disappear. Teachers described him as quiet but unyielding, a boy who watched carefully before speaking. He earned a scholarship to West Virginia State College, a historically black institution that offered him both education and a kind of refuge. Their law was not yet his dream. That came after he saw how often fairness bent under pressure. By the time he graduated in 1971 and later from American University's Washington College of Law, 1974, Walton had decided the law would not be a shield for the powerful alone. His early career read like a checklist of quiet revolutions. He began as a public defender in Washington, D.C., a role many young attorneys avoided because it meant representing those who couldn't pay, those already condemned by perception. He carried their files in worn-out briefcases, walking past marble offices that looked down on the courthouse. But Walton believed justice had to touch every rung of society. By the early 1980s, his discipline caught the attention of those higher up. President Ronald Reagan nominated him first to the Superior Court of the District of Columbia in 1981. At just 32 years old, he was one of the youngest appointees to that bench. Colleagues said he brought a mix of toughness and compassion, what later reporters would call judicial steel wrapped in courtesy. Still, the ascent wasn't smooth. He faced skepticism from all sides, from those who doubted a young black judge could command an often contentious courtroom, and from those who wondered if his discipline came at the cost of warmth. Walton met both doubts the same way he met arguments in court, with silence first and then precision. His rulings began drawing quiet notice. He was strict with schedules, intolerant of excuses, and merciless toward sloppy evidence. But beneath that discipline was empathy, the sense that law must serve the people who live beneath its weight. When you listen to his early statements from the bench, you hear a rhythm, steady, patient, deliberate. He spoke as if every word had to justify the breath it took. To juries, he was the conscience of the room. To lawyers, a standard. In 1989, Walton stepped temporarily into the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, working under President George H.W. Bush as an associate director. The era's war on drugs was controversial, a policy landscape torn between law enforcement and rehabilitation. Walton's presence signaled that the administration wanted both order and reform. He focused on programs for treatment and prevention, earning respect from unlikely corners. Yet the bench called him back. He returned to judging, and in 2001, President George W. Bush nominated him to the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. The Senate confirmed him unanimously, a rare moment of bipartisan agreement in an increasingly divided era. From that point, the legend of Judge Walton began to solidify. He presided over high-profile cases that stretched across decades of politics, from intelligence leaks to national security trials, always under the same principle. The law is not a weapon. It is a mirror. He carried himself like an anchor in storms others created. His rulings didn't shout. They resonated. Even in the most politically charged hearings, when cameras waited for missteps, Walton stayed still, breathing through the noise like a monk in robes of law. Narration drops to whisper. That composure would one day place him face to face with the legal machinery surrounding Donald Trump, but that confrontation was still years away. Before he could shake anyone's legal team, he first had to prove that no one, not presidents, not pundits, stood above due process. And in the dim light of that marble courtroom, he began to. The thing about a judge's robe is that it hides more than it reveals. From the gallery, all you see is black fabric, folded hands, a face drained of expression. But under that uniform calm lives a heartbeat. One that remembers where it came from, one that refuses to bend. Reggie Walton carried that heartbeat into every chamber he ever entered. He'd already earned a reputation for discipline, but by the early 2000s, Washington was learning that discipline could burn. Lawyers called it the Walton stare, a moment of silence so heavy it could rearrange an argument. His courtroom became a study in contrast. The air was cool, the tone polite, but the tension lived just under the surface. Walton never raised his voice. He didn't need to. When a prosecutor rambled, he'd tilt his head just slightly, the signal that enough had been said. When a defense attorney stretched the truth, the silence that followed was punishment enough. He wasn't there to perform. He was there to restore order in a system that sometimes forgot what that meant. He'd often tell young clerks, "Justice isn't about who wins. It's about who deserves to." The Scooter Libby case. In 2007, that philosophy was tested in a way that would etch his name into national headlines. The case, United States versus I. Louis Scooter Libby, the former chief of staff to Vice President Dick Cheney. Libby was accused of perjury and obstruction of justice in the investigation of a leaked CIA identity. Every camera lens turned toward Walton's courtroom. The trial wasn't just about one man. It was about truth under political pressure. For weeks, reporters dissected every word, every gesture. Walton never flinched. When the jury returned guilty verdicts on 4 of the 5 counts, the room seemed to hold its breath. Walton sentenced Libby to 30 months in prison, plus fines. A decision that balanced law and restraint. Then came the shock. President George W. Bush commuted the prison sentence shortly afterward. Many judges would have stepped back, avoided public reaction. Walton did not. He didn't give interviews or speeches. Instead, he issued a statement of rare clarity, that the commutation risked undermining public faith in equal justice. That single line told the country exactly where he stood. The rule of law wasn't a decoration of politics. The comment earned him quiet respect and occasional criticism, but to Walton, consistency mattered more than applause. Behind the scenes, colleagues noted how deeply he worried about public trust, that invisible thread holding the justice system together. Walton's docket grew heavier with time, terrorism trials, classified intelligence cases, and the never-ending flow of federal litigation that defined post-9/11 Washington. Each case brought a new wave of scrutiny. He presided over the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, FISC, between 2013 and 2016, a position shrouded in secrecy but vital to national security oversight. It was during that period that another test arrived, the revelations from Edward Snowden about the National Security Agency's surveillance programs. While most of the world argued on talk shows, Walton sat within the sealed walls of FISC, reviewing how far the government had reached. His written opinions, later declassified, revealed frustration that agencies had overstepped their authorizations. He reminded them that the Constitution was not optional. What the public rarely saw was how much those opinions cost. Every classified review demanded precision. Every oversight required courage. But Walton's guiding principle never changed. No matter the secrecy, accountability must survive. A quiet mentor. Beyond the legal storm, Walton also mentored. He helped found programs for at-risk youth in D.C., remembering his own beginnings in Donora. He often visited schools without cameras, speaking softly about discipline, resilience, and second chances. Students who met him said his presence felt different. Not intimidating, but grounding. One teenager later told a reporter, "He talked like someone who believed we could be more." To him, justice wasn't a place. It was a process that began long before the courtroom. Foreshadow of a collision. As the 2010s moved toward the next decade, the political landscape around him began to fracture. Social media amplified every rumor, every accusation, until truth itself felt negotiable. Walton watched from the bench as this new world blurred lines that once seemed fixed. He'd soon find himself presiding over hearings that carried names from television headlines. Investigations touching on former President Donald Trump's legal orbit. The nation would again turn to that same calm figure behind the bench, the one who'd already faced storms without blinking. For now, though, the story remains at a slow simmer. The judge sits beneath the dim glow of his desk lamp, case files stacked like silent companions. Outside, the city hums. A city that has no idea how much of its balance depends on men like him. Washington has a sound when it's nervous. It's the shuffle of paper through marble corridors, the click of recorders waiting for a quote that might tip the scales of history. And through that noise, Judge Reggie Walton walked the way he always had, unhurried, unreadable, unshaken. By the late 2010s, the air inside federal courts had thickened with politics. Every subpoena became a headline, every ruling a referendum. To most citizens, it felt as if justice had become another battlefield. But inside the E. Barrett Prettyman Courthouse, Walton still treated the law like a compass, steady no matter how many hands tried to turn it. The special counsel investigation into Russian election interference had already divided the country when one of its offshoots landed before Walton's bench. He wasn't investigating political motives. He was deciding what the public had the right to see. Journalists sought the full, unredacted report. The Department of Justice argued secrecy. In hearings so quiet that you could hear reporters breathing, Walton pressed the government's lawyers with precise questions. Had the redactions been justified? Could transparency coexist with national security? He didn't grandstand. He simply insisted on proof. In a written opinion later released, he questioned whether the Attorney General's early summary of the report had been objective. It was a careful phrase, not an accusation, not an endorsement, but its impact rippled through Washington like a cold wind. For a judge to even imply concern about candor from the nation's top law enforcement office was extraordinary. News outlets parsed every line, but Walton did not elaborate. He let the ruling speak for itself. The judiciary must remain a check, not a choir. And in that restrained paragraph, he reminded the country that independence is quiet, not loud. At the same time, the national security docket never slept. Surveillance orders, terrorism cases, sealed motions, all passed under his gaze. To the public he appeared stoic, but clerks later recalled late nights when he reread opinions until sunrise, trimming adjectives, sanding bias from every sentence. He told one clerk, "A judge's comfort can never come before the Constitution." When the government overcollected digital data beyond its legal scope, Walton's court, again, penned opinions that demanded correction. These were not speeches. They were instructions etched into law. But to the intelligence community, they sounded like thunder, a reminder that oversight is not optional. Then came the years when every branch of power seemed to pull against the other. Investigations, impeachments, indictments. Former presidents, advisors, and attorneys all drifted into the orbit of federal judges. Walton was not assigned to every headline case, but his words began appearing in discussions about judicial integrity itself. Commentators on both sides cited him as an example of restraint, a kind of moral metronome in a courthouse that never slept. When conspiracy theories targeted judges across the country, Walton spoke publicly about threats and the importance of protecting judicial independence. His tone remained measured. If the public loses faith that decisions are based on law rather than politics, the entire system cracks. Behind closed doors, he continued to handle sensitive criminal matters involving national security and high-profile defendants. Each case brought more scrutiny, but also more calm. Reporters. The storm didn't arrive all at once. It came like thunder beneath glass. Distant, faint, but unmistakable. Long before his name began trending across political channels, Judge Reggie Walton had already become a quiet legend inside Washington's federal courts. His rulings were crisp, almost surgical, never emotional, never rhetorical. But as the Trump legal orbit expanded, that restraint became both shield and spotlight. By the early 2020s, America's legal landscape had become a battlefield of filings, indictments, and televised hearings. Former presidents were no longer untouchable. Every motion filed carried the weight of national consequence. In that charged environment, Judge Walton's reputation made him a recurring name in discussions about judicial independence. Commentators from conservative and liberal outlets alike referred to him as a centering voice, someone who refused to let politics shape the pulse of justice. When high-profile cases related to the January 6th Capitol breach came before his court, he treated each one not as a spectacle but as a test of civic boundaries. He reminded defendants, lawyers, and even prosecutors that emotions were not evidence. At one sentencing hearing, his words echoed beyond the courtroom walls. "We are in a dangerous place as a country. The judiciary's role is to pull us back from the edge." There was no anger in his tone, only the calm authority of a man who had spent decades watching the rule of law bend under pressure. As investigations surrounding Donald Trump's conduct deepened, the public conversation turned electric. Cable networks spun theories, online platforms erupted with speculation. Through all of it, Walton remained mostly silent, but his few comments, often from unrelated hearings, carried enormous weight. He once noted that the public perception of fairness is as critical as fairness itself. It sounded like philosophy, but those listening closely heard the warning inside it. If citizens stopped believing in neutral justice, no verdict would ever truly stand. Though he was not presiding over every Trump-related trial, his name began surfacing whenever discussions about judicial temperament or integrity emerged. Journalists referenced his prior rulings, his defense of due process, his criticism of politicized narratives, his refusal to bend language for convenience. To some, he represented an older America, one where law was still sacred ground. To others, he symbolized a challenge. Could anyone remain neutral when every issue became partisan? In early 2024, one of Walton's remarks in a televised hearing went viral. While addressing a defendant referencing political bias, he stated plainly that threats against judges and institutions were eroding democracy itself. Clips of the moment spread across platforms like wildfire. His calm baritone layered over dramatic music, stitched into thousands of commentaries. Suddenly, this quiet federal judge became a figure of public fascination. Some praised his clarity. Others dissected every syllable for hidden meaning. But those who knew him understood. Walton hadn't changed. The world around him had simply gotten louder. Reporters began digging back through his career, rediscovering his service in the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, his sentencing of Scooter Libby, and his consistent insistence that the judiciary was not an accessory of power. Each rediscovery added to the mythology, the judge who shook political teams not through anger, but through composure. When legal proceedings involving Trump's businesses and associates intensified, commentators speculated that any assignment to Walton's courtroom would send tremors through the legal team. The phrase became a headline, "Judge Walton shakes Trump's legal defense." But in truth, he had not spoken against anyone personally. He had simply reaffirmed the idea that no citizen, regardless of office, stands above accountability. His rulings were procedural, his comments precise, but perception magnified them into national commentary. Every sigh, every pause, every word read from his bench became a line of code in the digital storm. Some legal analysts said Walton embodied the last strong wall of neutrality in an age when every gavel sounded partisan. His restraint, they argued, was resistance itself. In chambers, away from microphones, Walton continued his ritual. Reviewing files in long silence, annotating margins in neat cursive, pausing sometimes to look out at the Capitol dome. Clerks said he never mentioned the news, never reacted to headlines using his name. Instead, he'd simply quote his mantra, "If the law can't hold under pressure, it isn't law at all." Outside, speculation grew, about who would oversee future trials, about what tone the judiciary would take as the nation divided deeper. Inside, Reggie Walton's chambers remained unchanged. The same lamp, the same robe, the same measured breath before the gavel falls. That steadiness became, in itself, a symbol of defiance, not against a person but against chaos. He hadn't chosen the storm, but he was built for it. And soon, as the next wave of indictments and hearings swept the headlines, Judge Walton's presence would again become a point of national fixation. A reminder that even in a divided country, there still existed rooms where truth whispered louder than politics. There are moments when silence travels farther than sound. In early 2024, that silence had a name: Reggie Walton. Across the country, late-night talk shows replayed his remarks about threats to judges. Commentators slowed the clip, added captions, scored it with strings. They called it the moment the gavel spoke for America. To Walton, it was never about spectacle. He had merely reminded the courtroom that violence and intimidation cannot coexist with justice. Yet something in his measured tone, that steady, grounded cadence, hit a frequency people were desperate to hear. Within days, snippets of his voice flooded feeds. The judiciary's strength is restraint. Democracy dies when we stop trusting due process. They appeared on every platform, cut into motivational edits and political debates alike. To younger viewers, he was suddenly a symbol of calm authority, a counterpoint to the digital shouting matches that defined public discourse. It wasn't the fame he wanted. Those close to him said he barely noticed. He didn't even maintain personal social media accounts. But his clerks did. They saw the hashtags, the fan-made quotes, the edited photos of him beneath captions like, "The last quiet man in Washington." Reporters requested interviews. Networks requested statements. He declined them all. When pressed by a journalist leaving court one afternoon, he simply said, "The law doesn't speak through interviews." That line became another headline. Inside chambers, he returned to his routine reading motions, scheduling hearings, counseling new clerks about precision and empathy. Yet even his colleagues admitted the mood had changed. His name now carried a mythic aura. Law students cited him in essays about ethical independence. Civics teachers used his rulings to explain judicial integrity. While the media framed him as a lone hero, Walton saw himself as a reflection of something larger, a collective hunger for credibility. He told one gathering of legal interns, off camera, "People don't crave perfection from the system, they crave honesty." In a year filled with indictments, hearings, and televised confrontations, those words felt like oxygen. Legal analysts noted that public trust in courts briefly rose during the period when his comments circulated. It was temporary but measurable proof that tone still mattered. For a moment, one judge's restraint reminded millions what balance sounds like. But symbols come with shadows. Security around federal judges had tightened. Threats had multiplied. Letters, emails, and anonymous calls flowed through the system. Walton, like many of his peers, received his share. He never discussed them publicly. He simply continued arriving each morning at the courthouse, his stride the same measured rhythm, his focus unchanged. Those who worked beside him said he carried stress like armor, invisible but unbroken. Occasionally, when the halls were empty, he would pause before the bench and look across the vacant gallery. The same space that had witnessed decades of arguments, verdicts, and confessions. The silence seemed to speak back. Keep going. Outside Washington, civic groups began invoking his example in workshops about civic responsibility. Universities hosted panels titled "Integrity in the Age of Division." Clips of Walton's earlier rulings resurfaced with millions of new views. The phrase "the Crockett effect" once described a congresswoman's viral precision. Now pundits borrowed it for the judiciary, calling it the Walton effect. They meant the same thing, moments when composure defeats chaos. Historians often say that influence is measured not in noise, but in echoes. In that sense, Judge Reggie Walton had become an echo chamber for the better angels of American law, reminding a restless nation that process is not weakness, that patience is not silence. He wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't an activist. He was simply the steady metronome of justice beating beneath the static. In speeches at law schools later that year, other judges quoted him indirectly. Courage in the courtroom isn't shouting at the storm. It's reading the law aloud while the wind howls outside. And if you listen closely, that's exactly what Walton had done. By the close of 2024, new cases had overtaken headlines. The country's attention drifted toward the next controversy. But in the quiet corners of civics classrooms, in the slow hum of court transcripts, his influence lingered, not as fame, but as standard. Every generation rediscovers its need for calm voices. Every storm eventually seeks its anchor. In that sense, Judge Reggie Walton's legacy was less about a single ruling and more about endurance. The reminder that truth, however slow, always returns to the bench. When the lights dim and the cameras fade, the marble corridors of Washington hold their breath again. Somewhere in those halls, another gavel rests, waiting for the next question history will ask.